Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're looking at a highly visible and, frankly, often controversial cultural force. It's known as the Manosphere. Now, whether you've actually heard that specific term before, or maybe you've just noticed certain, unique vocabulary popping up in your social media feeds, it is an absolutely fascinating digital ecosystem, and it's one we really need to objectively decode if we want to truly understand modern digital culture.
Here's a quick roadmap of our agenda. First, we'll go inside the manosphere, followed by a breakdown of the four primary subcultures. Then we'll look at the sociological backlash, the broader societal implications, and finally, we'll funnel all the way down to its impact on modern intimacy.
All right, so Section 1, Inside the Manosphere, Defining the Network.
So what is it exactly? Well, the manosphere is a decentralized network of online communities, influencers, podcasts, and forums focused on masculinity, men's grievances, and anti-feminist ideologies. Now, what's absolutely vital to understand here is the evolution of it all. This whole thing started as just a fragmented, kind of loose collection of obscure men's support boards and early dating forums. But today, it has evolved into this massive, highly visible cultural force that literally shapes how millions of young men view gender, power, and really society as a whole.
Moving right along to Section 2, the four primary subcultures, the four communities.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the network is broken down. Within the space, we have four main groups. Now, they do occasionally overlap, but they hold very distinct core ideologies. First up, we've got the PUAs, or pickup artists. Their core focus is entirely on seduction and sexual strategy. They tend to treat romantic encounters almost like a game to be won through psychological tactics and manipulation. Next, we have the MRAs, or men's rights activists. They focus heavily on legal and institutional grievances, basically operating under the belief that systems, like family law or the education system, inherently discriminate against men. Then there's MGTOW, which stands for men going their own way. Their focus is male separatism. They actually advocate for total disengagement from marriage or cohabitation to avoid what they perceive as inevitable exploitation. And finally, incels, or involuntary celibates. This group's focus is deeply rooted in resentment over romantic rejection. It's driven by the belief that society operates on this rigid biological appearance-based hierarchy that permanently excludes them. So, where did all of this intense energy even come from? Let's get into Section 3, the sociological backlash, shifting paradigms.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast. Sociologically speaking, the manosphere represents a massive digital backlash against shifting gender paradigms. Think about it. On one hand, we have hegemonic masculinity. That's the traditional, age-old expectation that men absolutely must be the primary providers and the unquestioned heads of their households. But contrast that with shifting gender paradigms. Over the last few decades, women have gained significantly greater economic independence and social autonomy, and as a direct result of that shift, those traditional, almost rigid markers of masculinity have been completely destabilized.
So the crucial point here is how this community responds to that destabilization. For men who are feeling economically insecure or romantically disenfranchised, the manosphere steps in. It provides a very compelling, ready-made framework to make sense of their perceived loss of status. Rather than digging into super complex macroeconomic shifts or the nuance of changing social norms, these communities offer a much simpler narrative, that feminism is the root cause of their struggles. Impartially speaking, this ideological awakening to what they view as structural misandry is universally referred to within the community as taking the red pill.
All right, Section 4, broader societal implications. Let's look at the real-world consequences. You see, these internet ideologies, they absolutely do not stay confined to the web. They cross over into our daily lives. And we can break these real-world consequences down into 4 key points. First up, the mainstreaming of misogyny. Terms like alpha male, beta male, and high-value man, they've completely bled out of obscure forums and right into everyday conversations. It normalizes this highly rigid vocabulary for discussing gender. Second, we have the radicalization pipeline. This is huge. Social media algorithms frequently push young boys from totally benign searches, maybe they're just looking up fitness advice or mental health tips, and funnels them into increasingly extreme misogynistic echo chambers. Third is political polarization. Globally, we are seeing a widening ideological gap. Young women are becoming significantly more progressive, while a growing block of young men are adopting deeply conservative, traditionalist views on gender roles. And finally, real-world violence. In its most extreme iterations, particularly within what's known as the black pill incel community, Manosphere rhetoric has dehumanized women to the point of actually inspiring targeted harassment, tech-based abuse, and, tragically, acts of mass violence. Which brings us to our final stop. Section 5, Impact on Modern Intimacy. How this shapes modern relationships. I really want you to ask yourself, how does this adversarial ideology fundamentally alter real relationships and intimacy? Because when vocabulary like alpha male and high value man becomes part of everyday chatter, it fundamentally changes the way men approach partnerships. It takes the entire concept of human connection, strips it down, and reframes it, which often creates this highly adversarial, almost combative dynamic between men and women. And a core part of that adversarial dynamic relies on two specific concepts that are heavily promoted in these spaces: sexual market value, or SMV, and hypergamy. Basically, this is the teaching that relationships are purely transactional. It's just an exchange of resources, physical attractiveness, and status. The community really popularizes this belief that women are biologically wired to constantly seek out richer, more attractive men. They explicitly teach that a woman will inevitably abandon her partner the exact moment a so-called better option appears. Let's see how this builds upon itself in practice. On one hand, influencers are selling the illusion of control. They teach men that to keep a partner's respect, they have to maintain absolute dominance. So the advice they give often centers on emotional withholding, manipulative testing of partners, and viewing any form of compromise as a sign of beta male weakness. But the actual result? Well, instead of creating a strong relationship, these behaviors lead directly to deep-seated paranoia, adversarial dynamics, and a total inability to form secure, trusting partnerships. It actively blocks the communication and the emotional vulnerability that are, frankly, essential for any healthy egalitarian relationship. And that brings us to our conclusion, and really a deeply poignant irony. You see, many men originally seek out the manosphere to cure their own loneliness. Yet the teachings actively worsen their isolation. By framing emotional vulnerability as a fatal flaw, and by discouraging men from relying on their male peers for deep emotional support, it leaves them entirely dependent on romantic relationships for intimacy. And when those relationships inevitably fail, often because of the toxic behaviors the manosphere just taught them to use, the ideology predictably blames women. It creates this tragic, self-fulfilling cycle of resentment, anger, and even further alienation. It actively exacerbates the very male loneliness epidemic it claims it can solve. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I'm going to leave you with this one question to think about. If the pursuit of extreme dominance inherently destroys the very human connection it's trying to secure, what happens to a generation of men who are taught that vulnerability is a fatal flaw?